All right, thank you everyone for joining us today, what I've called the rental review. So today we're going to discuss what owners, investors, landlords, and agents should know when selling becomes an alternative to renting. And so to help with this review, I have Morgan Detvay with me. She is Director of Property Management with Rental Management One. She has over 2 decades of experience in the property management business. Morgan began her career in property management in 2000 and has held a variety of roles, including leasing agent, maintenance director, fair housing instructor, and portfolio manager in the Metro Detroit area. Each position has equipped her with the expertise to help landlords effectively manage their assets by staying compliant with legal requirements, making financial decisions, and maintaining properties to maximize value. So thank you, Morgan, for being here. We greatly appreciate that.
Thanks for having me and spending my lunch break with me.
You're welcome. Hopefully you'll still get lunch. So, as we said, so we're seeing more homeowners and investors consider renting as an alternative to selling. And so some of the scenarios, maybe they, initially wanted to sell the home, but now that the home is for sale, they're not getting enough traffic or offers. So they're considering, okay, let's put the home up for lease while it's for sale too, even though selling is the ideal. Or they have a low interest rate right now in their current home. They want to kind of have the possibility to leverage that in the future. Or they know upfront they just can't sell their house for what they want to get out of it. So if people are considering leasing their home, even though they were initially trying to sell, what should they think about before making that decision?
Well, I think that all of those different scenarios you mentioned would be viable reasons to consider renting the property, but the numbers have to make sense. And so, renting could be an alternative if you might need to come back to the home sometime, or again, if you do have a low interest rate and, you think you want to hold on to it. Or some people have to move right after they purchase a property and they don't have the equity in it. So they're like, hey, should I rent it for a year or two and let the equity build up? So like I said, all of those could be viable reasons, but you have to do the math and the math has to math, or at least know what it's going to do. So you have to think about the mortgage, obviously, taxes, insurance, but then most homes benefit from professional management. So you want to consider, are you going to need professional management? Are you going to live far away from the rental property? Do you want someone to oversee it? Because then you're going to have management fees. There's also going to be repairs. That's just a given. When you have a tenant living in the home, there's going to be repairs. Are you prepared if there's a month of vacancy, if there's turnover cost, if the home needs to be painted again? Utilities, if they're left unpaid or if the tenant isn't covering all utilities, you're going to have those. But then in addition to that, you want to consider what the city requires for rentals. Does your HOA have stipulations for rentals? Because a property can look good on paper, but if none of those things, are considered, sometimes, one huge repair can wipe out a whole month's cash flow. And then if you were really tight and dependent on that for it to make sense, you're disappointed. So my answer to this would be, yes, that's always a smart alternative to selling is to rent, but only when the owner understands the numbers and the risk.
If you've enjoyed watching this video and would love to stay up to date when I have more content like this or something similar that you may be interested in, please like and subscribe to this channel and click the bell so you get notifications. And I hope you have a great day. Yeah, because I've seen more of that on my side for some listings I've had in Detroit where they were trying to flip the house initially. They weren't thinking about renting at all. They ran their own numbers. But because there's so much for sale in Detroit right now, the traffic was very, very minimal, or the offers didn't make sense. And so we did put it up for lease and we were able to, lease them out. I don't know if the numbers worked for them or not. But yeah, that ended up being what they needed to do, but that was not
Well,
their initial
yeah,
plan.
and sometimes the numbers aren't like, roses and rainbows, and sometimes the numbers aren't great, but As long as you understand what you're getting into and understand the risk, sometimes it's worth it to do it for a year because that's the nice thing about renting. It's not a permanent decision, it's a transitional decision. So you can decide, like, okay, I'm not getting what I want this year. Next year, the numbers might look a little bit better. I'll be able to get it on the market earlier, whatever the case may be. So renting is not a permanent decision. And, we have landlords all the time that say, like, I'm going to be in the red a couple $100 a month. And that's okay because for me, holding on to it and getting some equity for a couple years is worth it. So they understand that risk. And so it's not that, oh, if it doesn't cash flow, it's a bad rental. You just have to be aware of what you're getting into and know the numbers before you make that decision.
Yeah, that's a good point too, because it's better to have some money coming in if you have a decent tenant versus it's just sitting there and you're not going to sell it or
Yeah.
sell it for a price that makes sense.
Yep.
Okay, so what is the biggest misconception homeowners have when they decide to rent out their property?
Well, I am a little biased on this, but I would say the biggest misconception about rentals is renting is simple. Like renting is easy. That you're just gonna find a tenant, put them in, you're gonna collect the rent, and they're just gonna pay every month, and it's gonna go smoothly. Now, sometimes that does happen, and sometimes it is that easy. But there are times when it's definitely not. There are ever-changing fair housing rules. Those get updated almost annually. Screening requirements have changed so much over the years. Lease requirements, security deposit rules, maintenance responsibilities, who's responsible for what notice requirements there are. I can't tell you how many landlords are still collecting first, last, and security and think that that's legal. And so there's a lot of misconceptions in that it's simple and that you don't need to be aware of the laws. And then there's also a misconception on getting the highest rent possible is the best outcome. And that sounds kind of crazy to think that that's not the best, but the goal is not to just get the most rent, it's to protect your property, maintain the value, and have a good tenant in there who is paying a market rental rate. So, there are a lot of people who wouldn't have been accepted at five, six other rentals. And so they might be willing to come into your rental and pay $200, $300 more than the next person. But are they going to be the best tenant? And is your home value going to be protected when they move out, or is it going to be trashed? Those are things that you want to consider, or misconceptions about renting out your property.
Yeah, because I think a lot of times when people are learning about it, they say, "Oh, it's passive income, so I just collect the rent and that's it."
Yeah.
What is professional property? Why is professional property management becoming more important for today's landlords?
Well, like I mentioned, there is like, ever-changing laws. And so it's getting more restrictive for landlords. Most municipalities in Michigan now require rental certificates where, 15, 20 years ago, that wasn't a thing. So there's a lot more involved on renting your property. There's a lot more tenant rights that you have to be aware of. Professional property managers not only like, keep an eye on your property, handle collection and uncomfortable conversations with tenants for you, but they reduce the risk. We help with marketing, screening, making sure that we get you the best tenant. Security deposit handling, that's where most of the disputes in property management come up is at the end, with move outs and damages. So having someone handle that for you. The biggest value also, in addition to the risk, is just the convenience. Having, someone always looking out for your property and not having to give up your, weekends and nights for emergencies or things like that when you're out with your family, that convenience is something a property manager can provide.
Good points. So what should landlords consider doing before they place a tenant into the property?
Good question. Well, the very first thing I say is know what your city requires as far as a rental certificate. So know that first. Make sure that you're willing to go through the inspection process. And if the inspection comes back with a bunch of necessary repairs, that you're prepared to do them. So that's the first thing. Second thing, if you have an HOA, make sure you know what their requirements are for a rental. A lot of them have to review the lease that you're going to use prior to, or they have their own requirements, or they, do their own screening sometimes. So make sure that you know those requirements. And then sometimes the property would be in an okay condition to sell, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's in an okay condition to rent. And so make sure that you're looking at your property under the lens of a tenant and the in a rental, and making sure that if there's needed repairs, that you're doing them before possession. And you want the tenant giving the property back to you in the same condition. So making sure that it's in a leasable, marketable condition prior to. So just making sure that you're doing that. And then lastly, something that's forgotten a lot is establish a rental criteria of what you're looking for in a tenant prior to screening that first tenant. So make sure that you figure out what it is going to be for you that makes a good tenant. Have that written criteria, and make sure you screen every single tenant against that to try to avoid any discrimination claims or fair housing issues.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So what makes a property a good tenant, a good candidate for rental management?
Well, talking about that criteria, it's not always just, this credit score or this income requirement. There has to be a standard, criteria for rental. And so something that we look at is their ability to pay. Do they have landlord debt or landlord balances? And sometimes for a private landlord, that can be a challenge to find. They might put someone else's name on the application to verify rental history. And so you're calling who you think is the landlord, and they're like, oh, yeah, they were perfect. But do you really know if they've been filed in court? Are they currently moving because they're getting evicted? What was the condition of the rental that they're leaving? Did they have bed bugs that they're going to transfer into this rental? Is there something like that going on? So it's not always, oh, you have to have a minimum of, 660 credit score or 3 times the monthly rent. Those things are important and they do play a piece, but you have to look at the criteria as a whole. So rental history, very, very important. Identity verification, very, very important. And so those are pieces of the puzzle that you want to consider. And then, of course, just making sure that your policy and your criteria is not discriminatory in any way, that you don't market your property with an ideal tenant in mind, that you focus on requirements of what you feel would be a strong financial profile of a tenant.
Okay. And then what advice do you have for landlords who don't want property management at all? They just want maybe a realtor to help them find a tenant or find a
Yeah.
tenant on their own.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of self-managing landlords, and they have, no issues. And so my advice to them would be, to educate yourself, and to make sure that you're aware, and then know when to ask for help. Know when it's getting to be too much, or, if there is a legal issue or a fair housing issue or something that comes up, know when to get help. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to call and hire a property manager immediately, but there are some things that you need to consult a landlord, attorney on. And don't just guess or assume, because those little decisions can cost you a lot of money in the long run. So, make sure that you're not negligent, that you get everything in writing, every request, every repair. That long gone are the days of a handshake for a decision or agreement. There's no more contracts on napkins at a restaurant. You have to have everything finalized, signed in writing, and make sure you keep good, accurate records, so that if you ever do have to provide a defense, that you're able to do so. So it's not impossible. There's a lot of people out there doing it. And using a realtor to find you a tenant is definitely a great thing, just because of how big of a pool, a net they can cast to finding you a tenant. But just know when managing the property yourself is getting to be too much and you need help.
Yeah. Okay. Are tenants hard to screen today, or, does the screening process just need to be more, thorough to qualify a person?
I would say 100% yes, because of the advances in technology. There have been a lot more advances in fraud. But there are still plenty of good tenants out there, but you cannot rely on gut feelings. You cannot rely on, I had a, good conversation with them and they're just, a nice family. Those things cannot don't always relate into a good tenant. You have to have a process. You have to screen applicants thoroughly. Used to be back in the day that we would put on our real estate listings, every interested applicant provide a copy of your credit report and your two most recent pay stubs, and that's how we screened tenants. And it was them providing the information, and that's just not possible today without getting hit every once in a while with fraud or with a person trying to scam you. So yes, it's absolutely harder to screen tenants today than it used to be.
Yeah, and so going into fraud, what kind of fraud are you experiencing now or that may be different than what you had before?
Well, fraud has always existed, but as the advances of technology and AI have come out, the advances in fraud have come out. So, people have always tried to manipulate pay stubs or letters from employer or fake, landlord verifications, but they're so much more sophisticated now. There are, AI bots that are creating fake tax stocks for people, that are creating fake pay stubs, that are making fake IDs, and especially in a world where people are applying online and everything is very digital, it's very easy actually to manipulate documents now and use those. A newer scam that we have heard about recently is people even using AI to create fake cashier's checks. And so this is a scary thing because we always say, at closing or at the, lease signing, you have to have certified funds and cashier's checks to move in so that we know it's good as gold. Well, now they just fraudulently make them on paper. And after they sign the lease, get keys, and move into the property, and we go to deposit the checks, the bank is running it through their readers and giving the landlord credit for the check, but a day later when it goes to pull from that other account, it's coming back that this was a fake cashier's check, that it's fraudulent, that this account doesn't exist. Well, at that point the tenant already has possession, they have keys, and so getting law enforcement to help you out in some of these situations where they are saying it's civil, and you have to evict the person can be a real problem. So there is so much fraud out there, especially in rentals, because tenants don't go through as much, title work and ID verifications as they do in a sale process. And so it feels like a smaller transaction that it might be, a little less, advanced as far as being able to scam someone. We had a situation a couple years ago where we had someone that repeatedly, bounced from house to house with different IDs and different credit reports. And he was just taking people's ID and making all the documents with AI to say that it was him. And it wasn't until the second or third time that this happened that we were able to get law enforcement to help us with it. So it is scary out there. There are lots of red flags. The nice thing about property managers too is they don't just process 1 to 2 rental applications a year as a private landlord would. We process 3 to 5 a day. So we are looking at tons of applications. We're used to seeing fraud. We're used to seeing scams. We know where to look for red flags. And so having that, help you with rental applications is just another perk. But yeah, landlords want to be careful, and even agents want to be careful when they're doing transactions. And so something that we're doing is having the monies exchanged before closing now on leases and requiring that they're paid 10 days in advance or postponing the move-in date, which is crazy. You want to give access at possession or possession at close, but there's a lot of, risk there for a landlord once a tenant does have possession and getting them out.
So you're saying you need 10 days before because that's how long it could take to find out the check is fraudulent?
It just depends on obviously bank processing times if there's holidays or weekends involved in that. So if someone's signing a lease on a Friday and paying their move-in money, at a minimum it would need to be the following Friday, and that's just our company policy, what we've done to protect our landlords. I'm not saying that that should be everyone's policy, but at a minimum, maybe if you have just one rental property, you want to meet the tenant at the bank, have them see them get the cashier's check, close at the bank, have them verify the funds, do something additionally than just taking the check and assuming that, they're handing over $7,000 as good as cash, because some of these transactions, the money's between $7,000 and $15,000 at move-in. And, when that check comes back that it's not a real account, they're already in. And, a lot of times the agent has been paid their commission already, and that's taken from the agent and it's taken from the landlord, and there's multiple parties involved. So it can get real messy real quick.
Yeah, I know I had one scenario this year where I mean, I can't say it was fraud, but I believe that it was because, I don't like a lot of realtors now they use the same system when if they're going to use the system at all to qualify a tenant, and I was using this different one. And so there was someone that saw the property and their agent just submitted to me the application from the system that everybody else was using and didn't even ask me like, is that okay? Can we use this? And, it showed that the tenant was ideal, had, 700 something credit score, made over 3 times the monthly rent amount. It's just them, no pets. You're like, oh, this would be great. But when I was looking at the document, I think it was something with the dates that didn't add up, as if like it said she applied on a date that was different from when she signed the document or something.
Oh, yeah.
And so then I just said, well, it's a soft credit pull. She still has to use this other system and pay the small fee of like $30. If she really wants it, she's going to do that. And I think it was like the next day or like within less than 24 hours, the agent said that she had found something else. And I was like, well, I don't really know if that's true. So, could have dodged a bullet, but I think that is definitely something that they're doing is submitting stuff that looks like it's the same system, but it may not have been done at
No,
all.
you're absolutely right. And what used to be like convenience of a tenant providing their financials is now in our world considered a red flag. So if a tenant is presenting and says like, I don't want my credit pulled again, here's a copy of my report and here's my, my paycheck stubs. That used to be considered it's convenient and I can just show this to my client, but now that's actually like a red flag and a big area for concern. We don't take any tenant or applicant provided verifications anymore because there's so much fraud out there. Someone can get their hands on somebody else's information and pull a Credit Karma and print it off at their house and have them present themselves as this person with a 700 credit score, and you wouldn't know. You wouldn't know that that's not them unless you're doing your own verifications. So yeah, it is, a challenge and something that landlords do need to be aware of because it's a real risk out there.
Yeah, I was even told by someone, I think last year, year before, that an agent told them that if they paid them $1,000, they would get them a high credit score. He didn't do it, but
Yeah, that's just crazy. That's crazy. But nothing shocks me. We every day, like I said, we do 3 to 5 applications a day. And we had someone submit a really nice offer letter to us, moving here from out of state, gonna work for Fago. And so we called to verify the letter, and Fago never even heard of this person. They just took the logo off Google and asked Chat to make them an offer letter and submitted it. And it's just crazy. We've had, where people are using Google Voice phone numbers for landlord references, and it's probably their mom or their aunt or their sister verifying their rental history. And so you have to be really thorough and you have to know what you're looking for, because if someone is lying on an application, there's a reason, right? There's a reason that they're doing it. Either they've been evicted, they're a habitual late payer, they don't want you to know that they have an arrest record or, I mean, a felony or something like that. So you have to know what you're looking for and do your work up front. That's the number one way to mitigate risk in a rental property, is to do a good, thorough tenant screening up front. That's the number one thing you can do.
oh, good. So are you seeing like applicants where maybe, everything looks good for the most part, but they just don't have the funds to move in?
Yeah, I would say that this has, unfortunately, bad apples have spoiled move-in cost rates for the bunch because now most landlords are getting the maximum for security deposit, which in Michigan is a month and a half. And so when an applicant wants to move into a rental property, they got to come up with 1.5 months for security deposit, a lot of times first month's rent. And then if the landlord requires additional fees, like, a cleaning fee or a pet fee or something like that, it can really, really quickly escalate on top of them paying rent where they currently live. So it is a challenge for a lot of people out there. And so what we see because of that challenge is landlords are having longer vacancy periods because people are needing to push the move-in dates back to a company for or to get multiple pay periods before they are moving in. People are also now having to pay like utility deposits if they've never had utilities in their name and things like that. And so moving, in general is just very expensive. There is some rumors out there about products that are becoming available to landlords to help tenants offset move-in costs or finance security deposits. We aren't currently using any of those products. They're really new to the market, but we're watching how they are being tested in other markets right now to see how this works. But I'm sure you've heard of like the Klarna or Afterpay or Affirms. And so similar programs to help tenants kind of finance their security deposit over multiple months and reduce the move-in cost. And so we'll be curious to see that if this is helping reduce vacancy times and how that process is being handled with all the strict security deposit laws. So we'll be watching that closely, but it is an issue. And so the one thing I will say about that is you want to work with people that are a good applicant or good tenant to try to, obviously get them into the property or work with them. But what you don't want to do is sacrifice your own protections and give up. Like I see landlords reducing security deposits to just $500 or something like that to be more attractive to tenants. And while that may be great for an ideal tenant, if you have a tenant who has any risk at all, that's not even enough to cover the last month's rent. And if they had trouble moving into your property, they're probably going to have trouble on the next go around. And if they don't pay the last month's rent, you don't even have enough to cover that, let alone damages if there's damages to the property or unpaid utility bills. So I would say, where you want to make, deals or concessions or, things like that, maybe on the timeline, but maybe don't sacrifice the amount of your security deposit because that is, what you have as a security blanket for when they move out.
Yeah, as if they damage the property, there's a good chance it's going to be more than the security deposit.
Correct.
Um, and yeah, I mean, if they need, I mean, moving in general, like if they have to hire a mover, that's another cost. That's a lot. And you had me thinking of something else, I forget what it's called, but like where they can split their rent payments, but like the landlord will get the money up front. I've seen something where
Yep.
sometimes that money doesn't even come through. So the tenant may have paid, but the company didn't pay the landlord. Have you heard?
Yes. So there's been a lot of different products out there, and we are more conservative of a company to just jump on the latest product because there are issues like that. There were companies like Sure Deposit and different companies out there that were saying like, the tenant just has to pay $199 and they buy a bond, and if there's damages and what happens when those companies go under? What happens, when those companies, can't collect from the tenant, who is out the money. And so I can't speak firsthand to a lot of those products, but I've heard the same things where they were collecting from the tenant and promised, had a guarantee note to the landlord, but the landlord never saw any of the money. There are products like that now when it comes to short-term rentals and like Airbnb insurance and things like that. And so we do see those and they pay out very well. Like we use Safely Insurance on our Airbnbs and short-term rentals. But as far as long-term, holding a security deposit in escrow is still your best guarantee.
Yeah, I mean, for this one that I was seeing, there was so the scary thing is there's no agreement for the landlord. Basically, they would put like let's say it's direct deposit, right? They would put whatever account that company told them to put in for the money to be pooled. So it'd come from the company, but the tenant would pay like twice a month. So let's say their rent was 2,000. So 1,000 be the first week, and then 2 weeks later they would pay the other 1,000. But the landlord would supposedly get all the money from the other company up front. And in some cases they would get no money. And because there was no agreement with the landlord that that program was okay, the
Yeah,
tenant
they couldn't
paid and then
collect.
they've gotta, yeah. So kind of scary. But
Yeah.
so is I mean, besides the moving cost, is it just taking longer to find qualified tenants, or does it depend on the property itself?
Well, it definitely depends on the property. A clean, well-priced property is going to still lease quickly. But if a property is overpriced and the landlord cares more about the getting over market, or it's not in great condition, that is going to really factor into how long it's sitting. So yeah, moving costs are a real thing, but there's other factors in there. Being priced appropriately right off the bat is very important because a lot of times you don't get a second or third go round if you've already had someone looking at it and they've determined it's priced too high and they move on. By the time that you make a price adjustment, they're going to have already found something and you'll, lost that opportunity. The other thing is if you lose 1 month's rent, if you have a $2,500 a month rental and you lost 1 month's rent, that's almost as good as it is as good as $200 less per month for a year being occupied, a $2,500 loss over the year. So pricing it appropriately at first is the best way to get a property to move quickly. And then there are more properties hitting the market that are not your typical rentals because we talked about all those scenarios in the beginning where people are holding on to properties with low interest rates. So inventory is loosening up a little bit, which obviously affects supply, demand, and the prices. And so rentals are getting a little bit more competitive than they were like post COVID for the, 3, 4 years after the pandemic. So you have to make sure that it presents well, it's clean. Like having scuffs and holes in your wall is going to definitely be a deterrent over another property that's priced the same. So you have to make sure that your property is presenting well and priced right out the gate.
Yeah, because a lot of people looking at leases, they're used to apartments where, everything is how it should be.
Yep.
And so they're looking at, private landlord and they're like, they're gonna paint, right? And it's like, no, they're not gonna paint.
Yeah, exactly.
And so like,
Exactly.
okay, so do I want this? They're just not have to, that's a whole adjustment thing in itself, especially if the price is higher than what it should be. But I had one last year where they want to do 4,200. Well, no one's saying I want to look for a lease that's 4,200. Their max may be 4,000. And as soon as we reduced the price, so we had a lot of activity and we leased it right away. But
Yeah, and so that $200 at the end of the day, how if it's gonna sit for a month or 2 months even, you would have been better just to price it at 4,000 right out the gate because you would have lost that money if it sat. So those are the types of things that we're looking at. People say like, what do you think I could get for this property? And so we hate that question because we could hold out for 6 months and get you this top dollar that you want, but you've lost 6 months of revenue. Is that worth it, to get an extra $300-400 a month when we could have leased it right away at the market rate and had a good tenant in there who's hopefully going to renew and stay in there for a while? So all of those variables should be taken into consideration when you're pricing your rentals.
yeah, that's a good point too. The length, like when you get someone good and they're not really trying to go, they may think they want to move in a year, but they end up being there for 5 years and you haven't had to have any vacancy.
Exactly.
That could pay off versus someone there for a year and then you got to renew it again and they've damaged the property.
Yeah, we have
Okay.
we have landlords too that will say like, can I put after this tenant, the next tenant, I want to increase the rent. But right now, we view a renewal at the same rate as a win. You had no vacancy loss, no turnover cost. You have a good paying tenant in there. And so if you are, wanting this tenant to vacate just to get $200 more per month, after you lost 1 month's rent, you're probably at a wash. So having a tenant in there that's going to renew at minor cost of living increases but stay and takes care of the property and pays well, that's a win for a landlord. So we are promoting renewals a lot of times too.
Okay, so where am I? Okay, so what should real estate agents know when advising a client who is thinking about renting instead of selling?
Well, I think we covered like a lot of the things that are important, just kind of knowing what expenses come with that property to help advise them on something that they may be forgetting about. What does the city require for rentals? Because some cities are very strict on what they require. And if you see the property and you know that the city is going to have a very, involved process to get it approved, maybe it's not a good option for a rental property. But agents can help, bring their clients this information, but ultimately just want to make sure they have all the pieces and it's their decision, what they want to do, and just keep that the landlord's decision. You don't ever want to persuade them one way or another, because if something goes south, that's, who they're going to blame. But you want to make sure that they have all those pieces and they know their options and that they make a good, well-informed decision.
Yeah, because that's the thing too of, I'll get people that they don't want to do the city requirements or things like that, but I've let them know this is what you are supposed to do.
Yeah, we have landlords too that will contact us and say, I'm not going to comply with the city requirements. I don't want them involved in my business, or for whatever reason, they don't want to do the rental certificate. A really interesting thing that happens a lot of times, though, is the tenants are more informed now than ever. And if they know the home is not a rental that's certified with the city, if we try to take that tenant to court for non-payment of rent, at court, they will dismiss the case because it is not certified to be a rental. So it kind of prohibits our ability to collect and pay ourselves and pay our landlords. So we won't even manage a property if the landlord is not willing to be compliant, because there's so many other repercussions with that. So in some cases it's easy, some cases it's not, but landlords just need to know that when they're considering renting.
And I think we talked about this already because I was just going to say something about just, I think going forward, investors should really just plan for both options when they do buy. So then they already know what they're getting themselves into. And, whether I lease it or I sell it, I'm putting myself in the best position to win versus just going one route and having to change routes
Yeah,
later.
there's nothing wrong with listing both ways. And, sometimes if it leases really quickly and you don't have to have a loss of a couple months sitting on the market, then, you can consider selling it again the following year. We kind of, talked about that and how renting is not a permanent decision, but it kind of kicks the ball down the field and lets you have some more time on making a decision. And so it's a good option.
Anything landlords need to understand that we didn't, besides this, the C of O stuff about tenants being more educated on their rights?
Well, I think we live in a like day and age now where there's tons of tenant groups on Facebook, and there's Reddit articles, hundreds of them, about tenants and what you can do. And so some false information, some accurate information, but ultimately tenants and just people in general are more informed now than ever before. And so back, in the 40s and 50s, a landlord may have gotten away with, not doing repairs and still being able to collect from a tenant. Now, tenants are more aware of repair obligations. They know when they're supposed to get their security deposits back. And if they're not back within 30 days, they know their rights on that. They know fair housing rules. They know about habitability and what makes a rental legal to live in. And when hot water goes out, they know how many days that they can have no hot water before the home isn't habitable. And so tenants are more informed than ever. Landlords can't just make up rules as they go. You have to have a good, solid lease. If you're using the same lease right now that you've been using since 1980, it's probably not, what it needs to be. And so just know that, it's not a bad thing that tenants are more aware. It's making better landlords, but landlords need to be aware of their responsibilities and make sure that they're willing to be compliant with those.
Yeah, I had a client that wanted to use their own lease agreement, and I think it was just one page. I showed him ours, but use one
He's like,
page.
"Yeah, I don't want the 11 pager. I'll take the one pager." And you're like, "No, you're gonna wish you had the 11 pager when it comes to a problem."
Um, so what Any new rental rules or compliance issues landlords should be paying attention to right now specifically?
So in the last year, we've had a couple changes. We had where HUD now requires landlords with 5 or more rental properties to consider Section 8 as a source of income when screening applicants. So that's something that, in the past we had been able to say, this landlord doesn't participate with that program or this home doesn't qualify. But now, as a protection for tenants who have a Section 8, if they have if a landlord has 5 or more rental properties, he has to consider their voucher amount as part of their income. So that's a new thing that landlords obviously want to read up on and know what they have to do. The most recent thing in the last 30 days is the new guidance from HUD on emotional support animals. So we have, kind of had these categories of animals, service animals or emotional support animals, and they were treated differently under either fair housing or ADA. And so now we got new guidance where emotional support animals, aren't going to qualify necessarily just with the letter from a doctor anymore, that they actually have to provide some sort of emotional service to the handler. And so there's more guidance on that landlords need to be aware of, but also tenants, because if they've been renting with an ESA for years and they go to rent now, it's important for them to educate themselves that you need to make sure that it's a well documented and meets the new requirements of an ESA versus, just what it used to be. So those are new things that we are following up on, and there's different municipalities that have different rules and maximums for application fees. Like the city of Ann Arbor has a max application fee. It has a required notice period of 6 months for tenants if you're not going to renew the lease. So knowing all of those things and that those things change really quickly is an important thing that landlords just have to pay attention to.
That's a good thing with the emotional support animals because I've had some people say, well, I have two, I have five. And it's like, you don't need five.
Yeah, I mean, that was definitely an area that was abused, and is still abused. There's websites online where you can type in, get a letter from a doctor, and it's $75 and a 30-minute telehealth visit. They've never seen you before in their life, but now all of a sudden a landlord has to allow the pet in there. And unfortunately, those types of fraudulent issues have ruined it for the people who legitimately need ESAs. And so they're just having some sort of guidance to help, protect the people who legitimately do need them and kind of stop the chaos of I have 13 cats and I need them all is, kind of going away. Thank goodness.
Are you seeing short-term rental owners, which most people know them as Airbnbs, evaluate, doing long-term rental options instead now?
Absolutely. So, this has been something in the last few years. A lot of people are going through conversions from short terms to long terms. Post-pandemic, the short-term rental market was really hot. People were choosing to, stay in Airbnbs versus hotels, when they're worried about COVID and the risk, and, they were vacationing more that way. So what happened is there's an influx of short-term rentals into the market because everybody wants to capitalize on that. But now when you have, saturation in your market, the nightly rates of each property start dropping and the return is not as good as it once was. So where it used to be much higher and, it was a no-brainer to do a short term for a lakefront property or something like that. Now, when you look at your cash flow and what you're netting, you might be netting less than what you would for a long-term rental. So we're seeing a lot of conversions from short-term to long-term. There's definite, differences in them. Short-term, the landlord carries all the cost, utilities, lawn, snow, cable internet, all of that. Where when it's a long term, they're passing all of that on to the tenant, the lawn care, the snow, the gas, electric, water. So there are a lot of conversions. We've actually, mainly eliminated our Metro Detroit Airbnb portfolio. And so we only now have one in Northern Michigan because of that exact reason. Most of them have converted to long-term rentals and some sold. So yeah, we're definitely seeing that. And so I think it'll continue, especially as restrictions on Airbnbs get tighter and tighter, makes it's just one more added thing to make landlords want to sell them.
Yeah, because I mean, would you say like all the other factors are, causing the issue with, okay, maybe I'm not going to travel right now because gas is really high, or maybe, just everything costs more in general, or somebody lost their job, so like
Yeah,
just Airbnb is
there's a
not.
lot of factors that factor into it. You know, the inflation cost of vacations. I think people still are vacationing, but they might be, more conservative about the cost of it. Also, now, that the pandemic's like, really far in the rearview mirror, more people are back to hotels and concierge type things. And so those Airbnbs compete with hotels and hotels that have great rates and have amenities like pools and restaurants and things like that. And so competing with, in tourist markets is really challenging. And then, when there is so many to choose from now, people are looking at what does yours have that this one doesn't? What makes this stand out? So the little cabin that used to rent, no problem. Now people are looking for, does it have an Instagram wall? Does it have a hot tub? Does it have something in there that's really, drawing me to it? So it's harder. It's harder to have a profitable Airbnb than it was years ago.
Yeah, yeah, because I know a few years ago I stayed at MGM in Vegas, and I was there for a conference, but I didn't have to. I left the hotel to go out one time because there was so much to do in the
Just
hotel
there. Yeah,
itself.
exactly.
Um, so, without making a specific market prediction, what rental trends do you think landlords and regular investors should continue watching heading into 2027?
Well, I think that it's going to still be a strong rental market. There's always going to be a need for rentals. There's a lot of people too that are watching interest rates really closely and just might not be comfortable with buying right now. So we have good tenants that, could ultimately buy a home but are choosing to rent. And so I think the market is going to it's going to maintain and we're going to have a good strong rental market. An important thing to know is like, every year rental rates increase 3 to 4%. That's the norm. Post pandemic, we had an 11% increase in rents. And so there was a dramatic shift in rental rates between 2022 and 2023. And so we're seeing a lot of those rates settle now. And so landlords have to keep in mind that what you got in 21, 22, and 23 for a rental rate was probably over market. And those rates have to settle a little bit. And so if you are renewing your current tenant at the same rate as it was in 22 or 23, that's a win. That's a really good, win because that was probably an over market rental rate. And sometimes when a property is coming on the market now, we're seeing those rates settle. And so if someone says, "Oh, my neighbor, they rented their home for, $500 more than what you're telling me I could rent for," my first question is, "Well, when did that property lease?" Because markets change so often. And so going into 2027, I think that it should maintain. We'll have a nice, good rental market, but if you're comparing it to 22 and 23, it's not apples to apples. And so we just have to be, aware that markets are going to settle and that's okay. And you just have to know realistically what the market rate is for your property when making a decision.
Yeah, that's a really good point because a lot of landlords expect to increase, every single year. And
Yeah.
okay, so what is one thing you wish more landlords understood before handing keys over to the tenant?
Oh gosh. Okay. Well, I would say that screening, of course, you want to before handing the keys, make sure you've done your due diligence, that you've screened everything. It's much easier to fix a problem before giving keys than after. A rental property is an asset, and so You want to take care of tenant concerns and treat it like one. And then also don't get super frustrated or upset that there's going to be repairs. If you go into it, thinking I lived there for 10 years and this never happened, why do I got to pay this now? You're going to set yourself up to be really disappointed in having a rental property. And so just know that repairs happen, that you're going to need to put money in it. But the whole time you're doing that, you're improving an asset that you're eventually going to turn around and sell and is going to hopefully maintain its value. The other thing is when you have a rental, no news is not always good news. And so I would tell private landlords this, that if you have a tenant who's been in there for years and they barely ever call you and you haven't been over there in a while because they're great tenants, don't assume that there's nothing going on in the house. They just might not want you in the house. So make sure that you're doing your inspections, you're checking your properties, and that you're not taking the, oh, they're easy, no news is good news. Make sure you're looking and that you know how the condition of your property is.
Right, because sometimes it's damage that they cause and they're too scared to ask you to fix it.
Exactly. Or they don't want to see that they have 5 new pets, or they moved in a couple other family members, or whatever the case may be. There could be something going on, like, it's now a grow house. You never know. So don't assume that just because they're paying the rent on time and that they barely ever call you, that it's the perfect rental, because that's a lot of times when we find the surprises.
Okay. Well, that was a lot of really good information. That is all I have for you. Is there anything else you want to add?
No, it was great hanging out with you for lunch, and thanks for having me. And if anybody has any issues or wants to, get a quote for property management, they have our contact information. And I just appreciate you taking the time to interview me.
Okay. And how can people reach out to you in Rental Management One?
Our website is rentalmanagement1.com, so you can go on there for a free property analysis. So even if you're just curious and you want to know what your rental will rent for, or what the fees are, or what we do for landlords, you can go on the website and get a free market analysis for your property.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. And thank you for
Thank
everyone for
you.
being here and hope you have a great day.
You too. Bye.
Bye.